Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the jazz fusion guitarist, composer, band leader. It's the one and only John Etheridge, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. Has been in a lot of bands, has done a lot of solo work, and is currently in Soft Machine. So you're going to find out more about John's life. Just to say, this interview, well, it took part over 2 different days because we did 1 hour each session. And yes, there was a lot to get through, as you can imagine. So do take notes. I will test you at the end. But anyway, after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. John, it's over to you.
So the people of my era, like Bowie, 1947, 48, there's lots of them, Brian May, and all these people obviously weren't an influence on me, because you're never really influenced by your peers.
No,
it's the people just above you that do it for you. And first of all, it was guitar players, because I was immediately attracted to the guitar when I was about 12. And so for everybody of that era, it was Hank Marvin and the Shadows. Hank Marvin and the Shadows were heroes for everybody of my age who played the guitar. Then, of course, the Beatles. And then for me, quite particularly was Django Reinhardt. And that was kind of left field. That was just a kind of happy accident.
Yes.
Because the band I had at school, we had the usual Shadows lineup, which was lead guitar, me, rhythm guitar, bass and drums. And the rhythm guitarist's father was also a guitar player, and he had these Django Reinhardt records, which we'd have never have heard. And he played them to us. And, I was completely knocked out by that. And that was something that is absolutely definitive for me, because it was different from all the influences that my peers had. Because the normal progress was Hank Marvin, then the Beatles, then Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, etc. So I had all those, but I also had Django Reinhardt. And so I was playing this sort of Django-y thing, or trying to. And I was into other guitar players. Then when I heard Clapton in 1965, that was a complete epiphany, and it was for everybody, actually.
Yes.
I always go on about this because I see it as a sort of tragedy that, in a way, but also not a tragedy, in the sense that Clapton, as much as anybody like Bob Dylan or anything, had a flash for like 2-3 years, and then practically died, and then re-emerged as this other person, this other Eric Clapton person that everybody knows as a sort of middle-of-the-road, good songwriting, middle-of-the-road artist. But, I mean, his contribution in around 65, 66 was absolutely pivotal, and everybody copied him. And his way of playing became the standard rock way of playing, very much as Charlie Parker's way of playing became the standard jazz way of playing, or Louis Armstrong's way of playing the trumpet became the standard New Orleans way of playing the trumpet. So this guy was absolutely seminal. But, so I was very taken with that. But I had the Django Reinhardt thing going as well. So my ambition was always to fuse these two things. And it still is. In other words, a kind of rock, what we would now call rock, let's call it bluesy rock, kind of sound and tonal quality with kind of jazz lines. And of course, that's what everybody was sort of working on in their own way. So when I got to London in 1970, there was Ollie Halsall first, I heard, with Pato, then a bit later Alan Holdsworth and Gary Boyle, and who was probably a bit more jazz. But this trying to get the fusion of a sort of a Clapton-y sound with jazz sensibility and lines and phrases and harmonies was a thing that we all kind of on our own were trying to do. And you didn't realise anybody else was, because I got a lot of stick in sort of the mid-60s for not playing like Eric and playing too jazzy and playing too so many notes. But he was very supportive of me, which was very sweet, and so was Jimi Hendrix. So they kind of encouraged me and to think that perhaps a direction was okay, rather than, you know, there were so many people saying to me, well, you know, everybody's playing like Clapton, why don't you? So, I mean, I'm not talking about big pressures. I'm talking about, you know, little thing. Everybody wanted to play like that. In fact, you know, around 65, 66, the competition was to be the first person in your area who could get the Clapton sound, you know, the Les Paul and Marshall and the sustain and everything. And I was half-heartedly not really playing that game. I mean, I wasn't convinced that I was particularly novel. And the other guys who didn't play that game were Steve Howe, Peter Banks, Albert Lee, Robert Fripp, and that's about it. And I'm afraid everybody else, and a lot of them are household names now, are really variations of 1965 Clapton, you know, and that was the template. And I like to emphasise that because I feel I was there, and the historical moment should be not traduced by kind of revisionism years later. And that was a historical moment, and only a few of us left know that. And, you know, and it's always the same. When you've been somewhere at the time and you actually were there, which I was 65, 66, 67, 68, I was there. I heard everybody. I was a guitar player. I knew everybody. I saw everybody. And so I feel in a good position to talk about it. So, which is why I always bang on about it.
Yes, well, absolutely.
But anyway, as far as I was concerned, yeah, you say Bowie, but of course for me, Bowie was a contemporary. So I didn't really listen to my contemporaries.
No.
To get back to the point about the older brother, I mean, you know, the guys like Clapton, Jeff Beck, Hendrix, these people were all about 4 or 5 years older than me. Not a lot, but it's older brother syndrome. You look at the person who's that little bit more older than you, who's doing something. Because if they're a lot older, you just go, oh, it's an old chap.
Yes.
And if they're the same age as you don't have the same respect for them because you're all in it together competing. So it's very interesting. It was, you know, for instance, I mean, I always had a problem with Led Zeppelin. For me, that was not interesting. Whereas, of course, people actually, particularly your age, and in America, it's huge. You know, it's like a fantastic, huge phenomenon. And for me, it was, first of all, the first album was a kind of rip-off of Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart. And then, of course, they did develop, obviously, I'm not knocking Led Zeppelin, developed this fantastic band. What I'm saying is just, for me, being the same age, I'm just going, yeah, right, fine.
Yeah. Well, I think with the Bowie and Lemmy from Motorhead, I think for them, which is your age, when they talked about their first influences, it was people like Little Richard, Eddie Cochran. You know,
no, I would be surprised at that actually, because that is the people a little bit. That is like the Beatles people or Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, who are then 5 years older. I would be surprised if Bowie's first influence was Little Richard, because, of course, he would have been 9 or 8. I think the important influence comes between the ages of about 12, 13 and 16, 17. That's when it really hits you. So I don't know what Bowie's major influence is. I'm not denying if he said it was Little Richard. But I would be surprised, because Elvis Presley wasn't... I mean, I knew about Elvis Presley, but it wasn't Elvis Presley that hit me. Hit me in the face, because he'd already been in Little Richard. I mean, I remember seeing Little Richard, which probably Bowie would have seen in 1964. So we'd have been 16, 17. So then maybe this is what he's talking about, because Little Richard came over and he did a television show. And you've got to remember, at this time, music on the television was very rare. And he did a TV show with Sounds Incorporated backing him up, and it was absolutely fantastic. You can see it on YouTube. Little Richard was so quintessentially it. I mean, amazing character. What an amazing character, man! For a black guy to be so outrageously camp,
yes,
so rocking. I mean, and what a man! I mean, Little Richard is a superhero. But so maybe it was that show that turned Bowie on, because Bowie would have been 16, same as me, when that came out, 1964. And if you look it up, you can find it on YouTube. Little Richard and Sounds Incorporated.
yes.
And it's a live TV show, and it's just, I mean, I didn't know a lot about Little Richard. We didn't know. And the reason why I also question that is because you've got to remember, in those days, you couldn't find things. Things just stopped being printed. You had to really search for these things. So to hear Little Richard, you really have to seek him out. And I think maybe that was the show that turned him on, because it certainly turned me on to Little Richard.
Yeah,
I was knocked out. And the Sounds Incorporated were a great backing band. This is a British band. They backed him up fantastically. And he was doing the whole, piano and Golly Miss Molly and Long Tall Sally. And I mean, he was it, actually.
Yes, I think there was him. Then there was Elvis. But I think with Bowie, I think there was this obsession. He has a picture which he joined the Little Richard fan club, and he had this kind of picture which had a little bit of a tear. And
I suppose he may have, because he may have been more highly developed than me. In other words, he may have got into it when he was 7 or 8 or 9. It's possible, because when I was 8 or 9, it was all Max Bygraves and stuff like that, which I certainly wasn't into at all. And there was, Jailhouse Rock. No, I actually, tell you the truth, I learned when I was 10 or 11, I was listening to, actually, I'll backpedal on this. I remember at our school, I was listening to Eddie Cochran's 3 Steps to Heaven, and I was listening to Jailhouse Rock. But my point is, the thing that really goes in, whoa, is when you're a bit older. And you're absolutely. So, I mean, I think David Bowie, I mean, I'm not going to talk about David Bowie because there'll be people who are such experts. But, funny enough, I did something opposite Arthur Brown, Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And he was an influence because Arthur Brown was the first bloke to sing in an operatic voice. He did Fire. He had a hit called Fire.
Yes.
He's still going. He's 81, 82, 83, something like that. Still doing his amazing act. A little bit less energetic than it was when he... But he was a real influence on Bowie, I think, Arthur Brown. But as I say, I'm not going to talk about Bowie because you'll be up against people who know everything, and I know nothing.
well, there's always, we don't really always know everything, and I think even
no. But I mean, it's like I know about Clapton, I know about Jimi Hendrix, I know about Jeff Beck, I know about these people, but Bowie is somebody who's an amazing career, an amazing artist, but I obviously came across it, but I wouldn't want to sort of say anything analysing it because other people would know a hell of a lot more. I don't want to be a bloke who passes opinions when he doesn't know what he's talking about. There are some things I know what I'm talking about, and some things I don't.
Well, we can always. But there was interesting you mentioned Django Reinhardt because it was Tommy Iommi from Black Sabbath. I think he became very influenced because I think there's something about the fingers. He lost the fingers.
No, well, that was not musical. That was the inspiration of the fingers. So basically, Django Reinhardt lost, not completely, but he pretty well lost the use of his third and fourth finger on his left hand, right?
Yes.
But he could plonk them down for chords, but he couldn't really move them very fast. So he did most of his stuff with 2 fingers. Most of the stuff we associate with Django Reinhardt, he played with 2 fingers, which is not as completely out of the court as you think it is, because sitar players and sarod players play with the 2 fingers, because those 2 fingers are by far the strongest. So Django Reinhardt obviously did have, but when it relates to, obviously had some sort of feeling of impediment, but it was not impossible, and he did it. Well, of course, it's impossible what he played because he was a genius, but I mean, the technique of it is not necessarily impossible. But Tony Iommi lost his fingertips in an accident, And so what he was inspired by was the idea that Django had lost the use of certain of his fingers but persevered. So Tony Iommi persevered, but I don't think there's any influence in his music. I don't think.
No, it's interesting. But then you had the kind of that world that was, as the 60s, approached, you had some quite experimental bands happening, like on that folk scene, which was quite interesting, was the people like the Incredible String Band. You mentioned sitar players. There was also an early prog rock band from Scotland called Clouds, or 123, that, I know, apparently the people, because I interviewed one of the members who's the keyboard player, Billy Ritchie, and he said that the audience was filled with people like John Anderson, Steve Howe, who were looking at
It would have been. I mean, if they were playing 66, 67, it would have been, because that first wave, if you call it that, Incredible String Band, and there were early bands like Fairport Convention around 67, and then it was 69, 70 that people like Anderson, Yes, and Colosseum, these bands, the prog thing really started kicking in around 69, 70.
Yes.
And became the dominant, certainly in English, British music, became the dominant force really until 75, 76.
Yes, absolutely.
And the aspirations of it really, really were the dominant aspirations until punk, and which punk didn't have as much influence as people say it did, but it did start to undermine the ethos. And the ethos of prog, which at the time, there again, because this was all my peers, I was prepared not to take particularly seriously. But now when I look back at it, I see that the aspiration to include so much, it's very expansive, prog. It's brilliant. It's sort of every element is allowed to come in. Every idea can be given currency. Every little musical influence can be incorporated. And for that reason, although some of the results are not really very high quality, it's the ethos of it is, I think, really quite inspiring. And then, of course, that's really the antithesis of the ethos of punk, which you close down and you shut down your expanded consciousness and go. It's the difference between, cannabis and amphetamines. When I think of punk, I think of amphetamines. In other words, you block yourself. Taking amphetamines, people used to talk about being blocked, and that was it. You're like, and that's got energy and anger, right?
Yes.
And prog is like LSD and cannabis, where your mind is opened and it's not so energetic, and it can be a bit it's very self-indulgent at times, and which is what people got fed up with. But at the same time, it's got I think really valuable aspiration, which I value now. I didn't particularly at the time, but I do now,
Yes, absolutely. So look, when you were at that perfect age as well, though, in those teen periods of seeing that birth of the hippie counterculture and the summer of love, 67.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how were you beginning to find yourself kind of getting a bit carried away, not just with
definitely not only was it summer of love, I was at Essex University, which was the most revolutionary university from 67 to 70. So we were always up to some sort of ludicrous rebellious antics, and there was a real you see films about the 60s. The most ludicrous, the worst one I think is Blow Up, Antonioni's Blow Up.
Right, yes.
Seen as some sort of representation. It's nothing. It's nowhere. It's nowhere. It's hard to recall it, but the important, when I say it's hard to recall, it's hard from this point where we are now in 2025 to imagine what life. Obviously, I have to be careful because I'm an old bloke now. I'm projecting onto my wonderful youth, which wasn't so wonderful because it was very frightening.
Yeah,
it was like there were no parameters. And the giveaway is certain expressions that come and go. Now, for instance, now, for years now, people have gone, oh, don't go there. Now, the whole thing in the late 60s where you must go everywhere. You must take acid and go into Hades or wherever you're going. But you've got to go there. Exploration. And that ties in with the idea of prog. Exploration. Always exploring. Nobody would say, no, don't explore that. Don't explore that. And questioning everything. At my university, which was a great shock to me because there was no hierarchy. You know, the academics were not in a different level. Everybody was mucked in together. And really, it was an experiment that failed because there was too much freedom. And really, nobody could handle it. I mean, the local mental hospital was full of Essex students who couldn't cope, freak out, you know.
Yes.
And everybody was always talking about freaking out, or so-and-so's freaked out. And I had a friend who freaked out, and he's just sat in a chair for the whole term, the whole year. And even thinking about it makes me feel slightly on edge because it was frightening.
Yes.
Psychically frightening. But at the same time, the people who were a little bit older, you know, the Beatles, Stones to a certain extent, they could deal with it, and they produced all this music came out of it, you know. And I do think prog is definitely from that zeitgeist, you know, and it was a little more organised. It was basically middle-class boys, you know, and that's kind of important because the point is you get when you start getting bands like Genesis, Yes, Pink Floyd, because they're kind of middle class. Middle class people can strategize.
Yes.
They can invest. So you make some money, you invest it in the show. You make the show better. You work on the stage props. You're always investing, capitalizing. And whereas the big working class heroes of the middle, late 60s, like Clapton and Jeff Beck and Steve Marriott, these people couldn't strategize to save their lives. I mean, they just didn't. So all of them blew up, and they were. I mean, Marriott. I mean, what a fantastic talent he was, Steve Marriott.
Yes.
You know, and Jimmy Page actually wanted him for Led Zeppelin, but I think they felt they couldn't cope with him because he was, you know. Whereas you get somebody like the Plant who trained as an accountant and he knows how to. You know, by the time you get to Led Zeppelin, 69, 70, people are starting to know there's a game to play. This is a game you play, being a rock star. And people like Marriott and Clapton and Jeff Beck and people who and Hendrix who'd invented this landscape. Of course, they invented this landscape without knowing they were doing it, and they weren't able to. Once it had been invented, and they died inventing it, then people like Jimmy Page could come in and capitalize on the landscape, you know, if you like, and be self-consciously rock stars and act in a self-consciously rock starry way.
Yes.
And I saw that happening. And of course, somebody of your age, you know, anybody younger than me you're not aware of that because you just see these people who are great rock stars and you think, but they didn't invent it. It happened. You know, and I've just seen the Bob Dylan film. That's another one where you've got a bloke. He doesn't really know what's going on, and none of these guys, Bob Dylan, Clapton, Hendrix, they didn't really know what was going on. There was a whole thing, a whole movement that they were swept up in, as well as being creators of it, that was kind of totally out of their control. So they all freaked out and died and things. And then you get the next lot, the Led Zeppelin lot, who know how to say, right, we can put this together, we know what we're going for, and we'll go for it. And it doesn't mean they're not creative or anything, but it just means they kind of know what they're aiming for somehow.
Yes. Well, I think with some of those characters, their manager becomes almost as kind of established as those artists that you know, like.
Well, yeah, and David Bowie's like this. David Bowie, because these people my age, you know, David Bowie also is coming into a world where there is such a thing as a rock star. Yes. There is such a thing. This is all invented in the middle and late 60s. You know, the whole concept of the rock star and something to go for. I mean, people like Clapton, Jeff Beck, Hendrix, they were playing in the equivalent of jazz clubs. And then suddenly it's like this massive industry. And they couldn't cope. Obviously, they couldn't cope. I mean, they just, suddenly there's thousands of people, and this is to do with economics and the baby boomers, or for whatever, but we don't have to analyse that. They suddenly had this huge thing, and then then the business heads start moving. Then the criminals, the crooks, the semi-crooks, I'm not going to name any names, but, the managers move in, the Mike Jeffries, these people start moving in because they smell the money.
Yes.
Suddenly there's money. When I used to see Clapton with John Mayall, it was just in the local boozer, in the room in the club with 70 people. That Anne Hendricks I used to see, 70 or 80 people. And Jeff Beck and all these people. And then it's suddenly, it's mega. And they can't handle it. And then you get the next lot who begin to know how to handle it. I'm not saying they'd perfected it. I mean, it gets perfected over the years, but they were beginning, and this applies to Pink Floyd and everybody, they're beginning to know how to handle this thing where there's a huge audience and huge amounts of money. Yes. And of course, it's a gradual decline in creativity. I love Pink Floyd, but Syd Barrett was the real guy, Really, I do feel in some ways that Pink Floyd after Syd Barrett is like Syd Barrett light.
Yes, right. Yes. Well, it's interesting. So how did you, because you mentioned that the slightly dark time of the late 60s, I mean, obviously there was the Vietnam War was going on. There was a lot of assassinations happening. There was also the death. You had the Summer of Love, then you had Charles Manson, then you had the death of Brian Jones, Joplin and Jimmy and Jim Morrison. So, it was quite a difficult time, I would imagine. And there was a lot of casualties. But because you did a history of art at Essex University.
I did. Well, because there were casualties were the people a little bit older, As I say, the people who didn't have any barriers up, who didn't have any defence mechanisms, like Hendrix or Janis Joplin or whatever, were swept up in something that they didn't understand and couldn't control. Bob Dylan as well, he's very lucky to survive. Because the problem with any description of any of these people is you hone in on the individual. Now that is not how life works. I mean, people now talk about Jimi Hendrix as if he's some sort of extraplanetary being, but he was part of the milieu. You are part of the milieu. He was always exceptional, but you are part of a milieu. You're part of a culture that exists. And the point about, say, somebody like Bob Dylan, if Bob Dylan had come along at the end of the 50s, or if he'd come along, say, in the early 70s or something, it wouldn't have been the same impact. It comes at a time when, for whatever reasons, and you can talk about this till the cows come home, there's a receptivity to something. And I really now think this is down to the Second World War. I wouldn't have made this analysis at the time because you're in the middle of it. Yes. But the end of time in 1945, one thing it's difficult to remember, even for somebody of your age, is we had no respect for tradition or what had happened. That was of no interest to us at all. Anything from the past was a waste of time. And I was kind of lampooned for being interested in Django Reinhardt. That's old music. Who cares about that? So there was a feeling that it was being remade after 1945. Now, I wasn't conscious of that at the time, but I think that's it. Now, Keith Richards said something like that in his book. I think it really is. It's very important for anybody sort of who's young hearing here, if anybody does hear this, that now there's a built up from the 80s onwards, late 70s, early 80s onwards, around middle 70s actually, when Western culture lost its confidence. Then it started looking backwards to a so-called golden era. Yes. Now, you might say that all eras look back to a golden era. Well, we didn't. We did not look back to any era as being worthy of study. In other words, it was that, I think, as I'm thinking about this as I talk, was the real special quality of the 60s. There was no reference to tradition. And nobody did sort of from really late 70s onwards, people would do recreations, Jazz musicians would recreate the Miles Davis Quintet of 1955. But for the era between, I'd say, 56 really, but say 1960 through to mid-70s, nobody considered that you should go back in time and be inspired by that. And I can tell you that this is out of your area, but in 1970s, when I was playing with Stefan Grappelli, and this itself is very interesting, Stefan Grappelli was Django Reinhardt's partner, violinist, and all through the 60s, he was just playing in a restaurant. Nobody was interested. And then in the mid-70s, people started getting interested. Oh, the past, Django Reinhardt. Oh, this old man from the past. That's really interesting. And about the same time, there was a saxophone player called Scott Hamilton, who's really famous and a great player. And he was one of the first guys to consciously start playing in a style from the past. And we thought it was so peculiar.
Right.
We thought, that's so weird. And I can trace that with practically anybody. Let's just go back to Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton played in a really fresh, original way in 65, 66. When he came back from his problems, he started trying to sound more and more like an authentic bluesman. And there was a sort of backwards movement because the past then started to become heavy on people's shoulders. There were reissues of records. You begin to be able to get records from the past, so you start listening to them. And then, of course, something that's from the past can so easily be idealized. And then, of course, as soon as you get into, our era, I mean, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. I mean, how can anybody do anything creative when you pick up a guitar and you go on YouTube and you're bombarded by a million guitarists telling you exactly how to do something, we didn't know how to do anything. We made it up ourselves. I mean, me, Jim Mullen, Richard Thompson, Alan Holdsworth, Ollie Halsall, Albert Lee, everybody plays in a way that is not orthodox. It's not schooled. So, this is what happened in the 70s. And it was 77 when I first heard about Scott Hamilton, and there will be equivalents in pop and rock. And it was like, why would he do that? Why would he play like an old guy? That's really weird. And now, certainly in my music, which is, I'm not a jazz musician totally, but I mean, from the 80s onwards with Wynton Marsalis, the correct thing to do was to play like somebody from the past.
Right, yes. Yes. It's
when I played with Stefan Grappelli in the mid-70s, I made no effort to sound like Django Reinhardt at all, and he didn't want it. Now, from the 90s onwards, when this got really you're meant to learn all the Django Reinhardt solos, and you're not actually meant to come up with anything fresh. You're not meant to. That's wrong. If you do that, it's wrong. That's the thing. It's wrong. And same thing, you're playing the blues. You go, that's not the blues. Or jazz. You're playing jazz. Oh, that's not jazz. That's and we had no. The point where I'm emphasising this is because in the 60s and very early 70s and probably in the late 50s, there was no idea that you should be looking backwards, that you should be taking inspiration from the past. Everything was moving forward, and it was like unplanned obsolescence. You never listened to last year's records. What are you listening to that for, man? No. Now it's so you've got a very fast movement of stuff. I mean, from the Shadows to Clapton Hendrix is only 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a different universe.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's the paradox that where we've got all these machines that are able to do things really fast, time now doesn't exist. Time was very linear then. So you said, okay, that was Shadows, mate. That's well over. Beatles, yeah, right. Oh, Clapton, yeah, no, that's Hendrix. Whoa, wow, yeah. So it was ruthless in a way, but things departed very quickly. But it was very powerful because everybody was open, because there was no wasn't the weight of tradition. So everybody was wide open, and because they were open, these things came in, like, say, Jimi Hendrix, and stayed and lasted because they came in and they were received properly received in a way that people remembered, whereas now people, I mean, I don't want to say anything about modern popular music because it's nothing to do with me. And I couldn't possibly say anything about Taylor Swift or something. What could I say? Nothing. But nothing. I mean, it would be completely arrogant of me to say anything opinion-wise about that, because that's now. But it's just different. I mean, it was very, very different. Anyway, sorry, I'm running off.
No, that's interesting. But with just that point with the Hendrix, he was there a sort of idea and a collaboration that he was doing with Miles Davis towards 69, 70.
Well, no, I think basically what happened, Miles Davis, who always had his eye, interesting, see, Miles Davis is an interesting character, always got his eye to the main chance, but somehow makes it creative as well. So he saw that, that's why he got John McLaughlin in, because he saw that Hendrix was, getting through to people that he no longer was, probably never was before. That's the whole thing about jazz. I mean, it was always, to a certain extent, an arcane experience, and has a certain snobbery attached to it, etc., etc. So when Hendrix, and then you've got this black hero breaking through to all audiences, white and black, everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, Miles obviously wanted part. It was much more coming from Miles than Hendrix, I'm sure, although Hendrix would have respect for Miles. But Miles Davis would want to have Hendrix to be associated with Hendrix because it would absolutely increase the branding of Miles Davis. And you see, Miles Davis is the difference between kind of a middle class boy trying to be authentic and somebody like Miles. And Miles Davis, in so many ways, a dodgy character and a woodpecker, or a cuckoo, taking people's ideas, stealing people's ideas, etc., etc. And on the face of it, a man kind of lacking in integrity. But because in his soul, he is a American jazz musician. And so whatever he did, it came out, even though his intention when he made albums like In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, so much of his intention was to get into the rock market. The way he did it was incredibly creative,
Right.
So you cannot bluff that stuff. It's like, as going back to Bob Dylan, I mean, everybody goes on about, was Bob Dylan a phony? Was he authentic? Was he a fraud? That's superficial stuff. If you like Bob Dylan or Miles Davis, you've got something inside you which has nothing to do with your overt personality. You can be the biggest arsehole in the world. It doesn't matter. If somebody said to you, Shakespeare, I just found out that Shakespeare, he was such a horrible guy. Who cares? Doesn't matter. And it's the same thing with Miles. Miles's motivations may have been completely corrupt, but he came out with some incredible stuff using John McLaughlin, where he would have liked to have Hendrix. But Hendrix went and died, I think before anything could happen. But of course, at that time, the thing would be Hendrix would be the big guy and Miles would be the supplicant going, hey, Jimmy, will you play with me, the jazz musician, help me to become big again?
Yes.
So that would be the power ratio in that relationship, and it could have been actually quite interesting because Hendrix is so open, right? And Miles is a good, how would you put it, a good kind of conceptualizer. So he would have find a framework which would have worked well for Hendrix, I think, and for him as well. Obviously he wanted to be featured big time as well. And I think that could actually, they talk a lot about these alliances that and you go, that would never have worked. It was like John Coltrane and Wes Montgomery. I mean, no way. But no way would come out with anything good. But Miles and Hendrix could have been
And during that period, did you get into the Beat generation, the Ginsberg,
No,
Kerouac?
hey, you're getting this all wrong, mate.
Oh,
I'm too young for that.
No, but during the 60s...
Mike Ratledge, who's just died, who was 5 years older than me, he was a beatnik. The beatniks finished around 63.
Yes, but your generation would have been going, oh, look, on the road.
No, it's people a bit older. It's the Rolling Stones generation that would have been into the beatnik thing, because the beatnik movement really went from, I think, around mid-50s to about 62.
Yes.
And then the 63 was an absolutely seminal year. And this is a real thing, 63. I was talking to somebody the other day, years ago, and she said she was a teacher during the 60s. She said in 1963, something extraordinary happened. And nobody knew what it was, but something certainly happened to me in 1963. I suddenly sort of freaked out at school and got into trouble with everybody. I was a very obedient little boy. And then suddenly, I know it's puberty, but I became, me and my friends became these kind of proto-hippies, really. It was all the Stones, growing your hair. But the beatnik thing, Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and Jack Kerouac and all that, just before my time. And it's very important, because when you're young, a year or two is huge.
Yes.
And so it's an interesting question, because I did the very, very tail end of it, which would have been 62, early 63. There was a beatnik cafe in Guildford called the Signet. And Beats used to wear duffel coats, right? So I bought a duffel coat and I went down to this cafe and I sort of mooched around pretending I was stoned, but I never smoked cannabis or anything. I actually smoked my first cannabis joint with Huey Flint and John Mayall's Blues Breakers in 1965. But I was pretending I was stoned. But that was right at the end of the beat thing. And the beat thing, I knew nothing about Ginsberg or any of that. And that's people a little bit older.
Had you sort of heard of the Battle of Booley then?
Yeah, well, that was way before that.
Yes,
that was when Humphrey Lyttelton got a saxophone, I think.
Yes,
they went, "Go home, you filthy bopper." People were very passionate. In the Bob Dylan film, they're talking about Judas and when he went electric, and what absolutely terribly upset so many people were. People were very, very passionate in those days. They were passionate about politics. But, in the smartphone era, there's very little passion, it seems to me. And now this is not necessarily, everything swings and roundabouts.
Yes.
Because there was so much more violence when in the 60s and 70s. We say the world is violent. Well, there are patches of extreme violence. But violence in Europe and America has really, really gone down, and I'll stand by that. People go, "Oh yeah, but there are knifings all the time." Yeah, but there was always violence, but it's the relative levels. The Pierre Laporte, the Quebec, the Canadian minister was killed. Aldo Moro was killed in Italy. These are European politicians being killed. The Bader Meinhof, and it was, as you say, it was dark in many ways, dark, heavy times, and it was very, on a personal level, very difficult. On a cultural level, it was very optimistic.
Yes, well, absolutely. But you mentioned 63, because that's in that famous poem, Philip Larkin, doesn't he? The 60s start in 63 with the first Beatles album and Lady Chatterley's Lover from Slight Memory.
Well, Lady Chatterley's Lover was 1960, but yeah, the 60s start, and there again, because I was part of it, you don't know it when you're part of it. But as I say, looking back, and people saying who were older than me, saying, yeah, 63, something certainly happened to me at school.
So when you were studying art, did you also become interested in the zeitgeist? The pop art movement was.
Yes, of course, it was Richard Hamilton and things like that.
Richard Hamilton, yeah.
When I was studying, of course, this is late 60s, so a lot of the people we think of as old faces had hardly come around, you know. They were hardly there. I mean, Richard Hamilton, I did Jackson Pollock, was one of my, abstract expressionism was my area of, and I was particularly into Jackson Pollock, and they wanted me to make a thesis marrying Jackson Pollock with bebop, but I don't think it works. But Pollock, I mean, to me, Pollock is like when we talk about Bob Dylan or earlier Clapton or even Hendrix or something. This is somebody who's doing something and it comes out a certain way and they really don't understand how that happened. And I think all these people freak out because they're doing something and people go, "You're a genius. Bloody hell, mate, you're a genius. How did you do that?" And you're going, Bob Dylan said it and Clapton said it. I don't know. It's happening. And this is the magic. This is the divine touch. And Jackson Pollock had this for 3 years. If you go to a Pollock exhibition, don't bother with all the early stuff. Forget about that. Go straight to 1947 to about 51, when for 4 years he did the most, it really something. You go and look at these pictures and, I mean, this is what I love. You go and you look at them and you go, yeah, but what is it? It's incredible. But what is it? Just like listening to Bob Dylan. You go, you know, the lyrics, you go, it's poetry. What is it? What is it? Why is it so good? I don't understand. But it is. Yeah. And that's the thing with Pollock. And then, of course, somebody tried to analyse it and he got fucked up and went back to boozing and never did another good thing again.
What about Mark Rothko? Did you?
Yeah, well, we did him as well. Yeah, poor old Rothko. He committed suicide, didn't he, in the end? But I think it was the pressure of his agent demanding. But that's amazing as well. Rothko is amazing as well. But I mean, it was particularly Pollock that I was into, and of course, I was into the whole Jackson Pollock kind of thing. My best mate at school looked a bit like Jackson Pollock, and yeah, amazing to look, you know, with the fag in the mouth and dripping the paint and.
And did you get into the performance art movement that started at that time with people? I mean, there was.
Well, you've got to remember, I went to university to please my parents.
Right.
I mean, really, if I'd stayed in London in 1967 and carried on playing, luckily I didn't miss out completely because I came back in 1970 and things were still going on. Mm. And I think actually I came back in 1970 and got straight into doing good things because I think by then everybody was fed up with the Eric Clapton guitar thing. When I kind of left London and went to university around 67, everybody still wanted you to play like Clapton. But when I came back, everybody had enough of that. So the fact that I was doing something a bit different got me loads of work immediately. Anyway, that's the side. No, that's the main point. But your question about the history of
performance art movement. That, there was people like.
I studied art. Hang on a sec. I didn't study art. I studied history of art.
Right.
So which is completely different. And I only studied it because I thought it'd be a cushy number. The department was starting, and I thought I'll easily get a degree. It'll be cushy.
Right.
But having said that, I did get into it. I mean, I had some great teachers, and I really liked it. And I got very into it, and I became a pretty good art critic. But I didn't have any. One of the reasons I have really not that much respect for critics because I found I could do it so easily. Start waffling about painting, you know, and. I couldn't do it now, but I could just waffle about painting and what it meant. And when I see these programs with these sort of art historian stars waffling, I go, yeah. It's about the paint on canvas, mate. Because I know this from music. Music critics are usually miles away from it. Not all of them. Some of them are great. The ones that say nice things about me are great. But basically, you can't mix these mediums. The only place where that kind of criticism is viable is in literature, because literature is words, criticism is words. That goes together. But music is music, words are words. Painting is painting, and words about painting are. But having said that, the critic has a very important role to play. In other words, in kind of advertising.
Yes, I mean it's signposting, you know.
Exactly.
So look, then the 70s start, and obviously, and I found doing this, and at that stage in your life career, where you're sort of a bit of conscious of, your age is still dictating your life, probably ish. Each kind of 3 to 5 years, there's a new wave of 16 to 18-year-olds come along, and
Yeah.
like you kind of mentioned earlier, you almost think, oh, that was 3 years ago. That's boring old
Yeah.
man stuff. Even though those bands are probably only 23, but when you're young, you want to discover something which is fresh. It's got that first single.
Yes. Yes.
And so the 70s come along, and it's a very clear, different, kind
Well,
of.
yes. I mean, the 70s was my era, if you like, really. When I was sort of, in my early 20s,
Yes.
start getting things together. And so in that sense, I mean, I was in the prog world, even though I was listening to other things, but I was in that prog world playing with Daryl Ways, Wolf, and then the Soft Machine. And that was the point where I was playing big brother to some younger people. In other words, I was kind of, if you say in terms of importance, I mean, I'm not claiming I'm important in the artist in the world of music, but if there was any importance going on, it was in that period when when I got to join the Soft Machine. I thought, well, there's only a few people who can do what's required for this job.
Yes,
and we are we are the few people at the forefront of this. And then, of course, then really it wasn't so much punk, but then you get to about late 20s, 30, and your ear for what's current, your ear for what's going to be a hit, your ear for what's relevant starts disappearing.
Yes.
And I remember absolutely horrified. I was playing with Nigel Kennedy. This would have been about middle 90s, and we went to some big convention, and the head of EMI was a guy who was a Peter Green fan, and he was my age. And I thought, no wonder your record company is going down the hill, because I, like you, have no idea what young people are going to want to listen to. If you're hung up on Peter Green and blues harmonica players, how can you possibly be an A&R man for modern music? Because after that early 30s, you haven't got a clue. You know what you like, but when up until that age, you can hear something and go, oh yeah, that's going to be a hit. I used to be able to spot a hit. I'm sure you were the same.
Yes.
You're able to spot a hit, right? You just feel it. You know that's because you are part of that thing and you're connected to that thing. And late 20s, early 30s, you start to lose that. And that is when the young people can't come on, you old fucker. And this happened with punk with us. I was 28 when punk started. And it was like, oh, piss off,
But before that, because you had a period with Warhorse, but then you also...
No, I was only Warhorse for about a second. Basically, the trajectory, if I just sum it up, I mean, I came to London in 1970, played with loads of bands briefly, like Warhorse, very, very briefly.
Yes.
I was quite intransigent, and I'd sort of walk out of bands. I think Warhorse, actually, I kind of got the job, and then they didn't really like me. They wanted something a bit more rock and roll, so they kind of, basically, they didn't want me, actually. And then there were loads of other bands I sort of got into for a bit and then didn't like because I was fussy.
Yes.
And when I got into Daryl Waves' thing, I wasn't that keen on that. He wasn't that keen on me, actually, but I got some stratospherically over-the-top press about my playing, particularly from Chris Welch, who was the leading music journalist of the time.
Yes.
So I thought, well, this is good. And Daryl thought, well, I don't really like him. He wanted me to play like Richie Blackmore. But he also was thinking, well, this guy's going down well. So we sort of stayed together. I mean, I love Daryl. He's a great guy. But I think he had reservations about me, and I had sort of reservations about the whole thing. It was all a bit sort of... well, I was so snobby, I was listening to John Coltrane and things, and I'm thinking, this is all a bit beneath me, this proggy thing.
Yes.
But Soft Machine, I was desperate I was so pleased to join.
But before that, there's a little bit of a local connection, isn't there? James Lascelles, the Global Village Trucking, who were in Dis, who were just down the road that we, we kind of know James. And
you know James, do you?
Well, only through the fact that
I saw him the other day. I hadn't seen him for years. He's wonderful, a great keyboard player. And
amazing.
That was a lovely period. So basically, the Wolf thing finished. We made a few albums, some of which are quite good, actually, and some good tracks. And that was the first time, as I say, I was getting public recognition. And then I was still doing anything. And James phoned up and said, Mick Medora, have you got any ideas about a guitar player? I said, well, I'm not doing anything. He said, no, it wouldn't be for you. I went, well, come on. So I went up there, and it was such a lovely environment, and it was non-stop music making.
So was that down in Dis, or was it?
Yeah, in Dis. Yeah, they had the church farm.
They had the farm.
It was a big farm with a huge house, and there was like non-stop jamming going on in this.
Was Mike Story there at the time?
No, I met Mike Story. I know Mike Story. He was associated, but I don't remember him being there. The band was Jimmy Lascelles, John McKenzie, great bass player, who was then about 18, 19, and went on to have a great career, but died. Sir Simon Stewart Richardson on drums, John Owen vocals, and myself. Replacing a guy called Mick Medora. And but basically what happened was I was very happy doing it. It was like an English Grateful Dead. And,
yes.
But then the Soft Machine thing came up, and I thought, well, this is my destiny. I've got to do it.
And did you? I mean, because people like James and Mike Story, they had an album together which was produced by John Porter, who was in Roxy Music. Called
I've done John Porter. I did a recording with John Porter quite recently for Chris Jagger. Yeah, nice guy,
magic,
and he's got some great guitars. Bloody hell.
Yes,
I used his guitars to do the recording.
Yeah, well, they got into East Anglia, got into quite a hippie movement during that period. You would have, Ley Limestone Circles, Bruce Lacey's Rituals. It was the fairs of Barsham and Albion. Did you? And from those little videos of everyone hanging out and having, lovely ideas, did you also embrace that hippie?
Yeah, I loved that. I loved it. But I just felt that this Soft Machine thing came up, and I felt I had to do it. I mean, Alan Holdsworth set me up for it, and I just thought, well, this is my destiny. This is what I should be doing, because this is the area that I'm really interested in, even though I recognise that it would be not nearly so much fun as being in the Global Village Trucking Company, which was really a lovely family feeling.
Yes.
But it was, and the Soft Machine certainly wasn't a family feeling, it was the antithesis. But I felt, and it's right, because I was in Soft Machine, I also started playing with Stefan Grappelli later, through playing with the Soft Machine, because somebody saw me on telly and then recommended me to Disney. How these things work. And so I think I was very, very fortunate to do it. And funnily enough, the very day I joined the Soft Machine, Peter Gabriel phoned up, and he just left Genesis.
Right. And you went...
he phoned up and said, I'm trying to put something together. Because if that had happened a week before, but I was just really chuffed to have joined the Soft Machine. And then I started to, I got really, the playing sort of really came together with the Soft Machine. I started playing how I dreamt I wanted to play, which I think everybody does. You sort of dream that you're going to play a certain way. It never happens. And then it sort of comes together, and you'll start playing how you dreamed you'd be playing. And that happened to me with the Soft Machine. It was like that was the moment.
Yes. Were you on two albums with them?
Softs, which was 1976, and Alive and Well, 77, and then there was a compilation Triple Echo. And so, I mean, really, it was there again. The time is much longer in that when you're young. So it was sort of 75, and then what happened at 77, I got an offer to join Stefan Grappelli, which was very weird. And I went to the Soft Machine people, and I said, look, Stefan Grappelli's got this world tour. And of course, Stefan Grappelli was like John the Baptist. I mean, Django Reinhardt was God.
Yes.
Stefan Grappelli was John the Baptist. So the opportunity to play with him was like ridiculous. I mean, I used to dream about playing with Stefan Grappelli when I was a teenager. I thought,
yes.
Django's dead, but Stefan Grappelli is still alive. I could play with him, and that would be amazing, But I could meet him. That was all I wanted to do. I could meet Stefan Grappelli. And then suddenly, out of the blue, Soft Machine were on the telly in, I don't know, 76, 77. And Diz Disley, who was organising the band to accompany Stefan Grappelli, met a guy called Pete Shade in Oxford Street and said to him, I'm looking for a young guitar player. I'm looking for a new guitar player. And this guy said, I just saw this bloke last night on the telly. So he gave him my name, and Diz Disley appears out of the blue. Hello. I said, what? What are you doing here, Diz Disley? He said, well, we're looking for a new guitarist for Stefan Grappelli. I went, what? He said, well, you've been highly recommended. I went, well, all right. So I went along, and then I wasn't playing cute, but I said, look, okay, we've done a couple of gigs, but I can't do the tour because I'm with the Soft Machine. And he wouldn't have it. And very luckily, he'd offered me the gig with Stefan Grappelli, Diz Disley, and I sort of said I can't really do it because of Soft Machine. And very luckily, he had the sort of character where he just persevered. He said, I can't believe you've turned this down. Come on. So I went to the Soft Machine and I said, well, have you got any gigs? And they really didn't have many gigs in the book. I said, look, I've been offered a 3-month tour with Stefan Grappelli. I'd like to do it. So I did that in between Softs and Alive and Well.
Yes.
3 months. Then we did Alive and Well, which was a really good record. I really liked, and we did some good gigs and things. And then it just sort of petered. I think partly it was my fault. I mean, because I was still playing with Stefan, and that was I was kind of happy with that, really. And I wouldn't say the Soft Machine was going nowhere. I don't think that's fair. But, it sort of petered out, really. And the Stefan Grappelli thing continued for quite a long time, and it was a fantastic gig.
Yes.
Which I really enjoyed. But
we got to the 80s, and then after your band Second Vision, I think we were into Second Vision, weren't we?
Oh, right. No, we didn't get into Second Vision, but I can tell you about that. Basically,
yes.
Well, Rick Sanders had joined the Soft Machine right at the end. And when that sort of was petering out, I was doing the Stefan Grappelli thing. But he said, could we, let's put something together. And he had a friend, Dave Bristow, keyboard player, that I played with, a marvellous guy and very, very talented. And we got him, and we got Mickey Barker, who was a friend of Rick's, and John Davey, they knew, on bass. And the thing was, there was a management by a guy called Joe Lustig, who was quite a big deal in those days. He managed Richard Thompson and quite a few other people. And he was interested, and he got a deal with Chrysalis Records, and we made this one album, which was very high production, actually. And we got John Cameron was the producer, who'd done quite a lot of production, quality production work, and so it was quite an expensive album. And what I remember, particularly for as far as I was concerned, was when I started doing the guitar solos. He said, "Right, F, guitar solos," and so I went down there. I started. He went, "Hang on. I like the first 4 bars. Right, we'll drop in after the first 4 bars." And do another 4 bars, taking over from those 4 bars. Now, of course, that's a bit like TV acting. You think it's easier, but actually it's more difficult. And he really wanted to do it this way. And there's one solo which isn't like that, and that's on the second track, which is called Dancing Circle, which was actually live in the studio solo. But all the other ones were put on bit by bit. And it kind of works, actually. It's an interesting process, because this is what people like, Larry Carlton would do, or Alan Holdsworth or something. They always did it like that. And it's not very exciting at the time, but years later you listen to it and you go, oh, God, that's a really well-constructed solo.
Right.
And for instance, if you listen to the Larry Carlton solo on Kid Charlemagne, I mean, one of the perks he was allowed, everybody else who played guitar on the Steely Dan record pretty well had to stand in the studio and be criticised by Donald and Walter, and generally sort of kind of ground down. Happened to Mark Knopfler, apparently, kind of ground down, But Larry Carlton, because he was their MD, I think he was allowed to take the tapes away to his studio. So Kid Charlemagne, I'm absolutely convinced, is put on phrase by phrase. And, of course, you end up, 20 years later, you listen, you go, what a wonderful solo, so well constructed. But I'd never done that before. So that's one of my memories of that thing, also very well recorded. And it came out on Chrysalis Record. And I think, as usual, there was some bad luck. I think the bit of bad luck this time was all the music papers were on strike. So we didn't get any. We got one nice review from Derek Jewell in the Sunday Times, but basically there weren't that many reviews. And then it never really got out on the road. Partly because I was kind of with Stefan Grappelli, and I do remember that I completely messed up my situation with Stefan Grappelli by saying to him, Joe Lustig promised us the Montreux Jazz Festival, which I think we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
He said we're going to be doing the Montreux Jazz Festival. So it's so stupidly sort of impolitic, undiplomatic, and naive. I said to Stefan Grappelli, there was a tour coming up. I said, I'm not sure I might not be able to do that tour, Stefan, because my band might be playing at the Montreux Jazz Festival. So, of course, he went up the wall, and I was totally in bad odour with everybody. Of course, the Montreux Jazz Festival never happened. Of course it didn't.
Right.
I mean, I still hadn't learned. I was by then 30, just over 30, and I still hadn't learned that 99% is bullshit, particularly from somebody like that. They say they've got the Montreux Jazz Festival. He might have actually called Claude Knobs. That might have been the or in those days he didn't email or messaged him in some way. That would have been the size of it. So, of course, there was no Montreux Jazz Festival. But not, my name was sort of slightly besmirched, and probably led to my sort of my Stefan Grappelli demise about 6 or 7 months later. Because they don't like it, people like that. If you sort of say, I've got somebody more important to play with, you're not meant to do that. You must never do that. Rule number one of being a sideman.
Well, it's a bit like when you're young and you're going out for an evening, and then you get a better offer, so you ditch that first person, and then the second people.
Yeah, but a better offer, that's fine. But I mean, this was just ridiculous, and I wasn't that young. And years later, I learned, if you're with a band leader, no names, no patrol, but if you're playing with somebody who's got a big ego, if they say, "What have you been doing, man?" You've got to give the impression you haven't been doing anything except waiting for them to call. That's what they want to hear. You don't have to say that, but you must never give the impression that you've been like having a really great time and being really successful and everything's going for you, because people don't, people like that don't want you to be like that. They want you to be saying, "Oh, mate, I'm just waiting for you to call me." That's what it's like.
Excellent.
I've played with people who I remember one guy, I'm not going to say who it was, but one of the members of the band got a really good job offer, which wouldn't necessarily have conflicted with the band. But when this person sort of, I said, don't tell the band leader, don't tell him, And of course they did. I'm so excited, I've got this job, I've got to tell everybody. Next thing, you're out. So it's a ruthless world. Somebody did actually try to sue Van Morrison for wrongful dismissal, I heard. But I mean, in our world, it's amazing if you people who have ordinary jobs and they can't just be chucked on a whim.
No, this is true, but there's
I have to say, I've been a band leader for a long time, and I don't chuck people on a whim. But there is no redress, and there's no legal responsibility, and there's no contracts, and there's no. So basically, just like everything else in modern life, the treatment of musicians, and I luckily am not. I'm only even over the last few years, I've hardly been an employed musician. Either been leading the band or an equal partner, say with John Williams or something, but. Basically, the abuse of musicians, just like anybody, any working person, has increased since Thatcher Reagan.
Yes.
Like Amy Winehouse were paying like 150 quid per musician. So, and things like that, and whereas in the 60s and 70s, there was a much more equal distribution of wealth, but this has gone along with the general tenor of society. If you have to do the job, somebody will get you to do it for practically nothing. And
yes.
Luckily, that's all over for me, so I can tell you about it. Because I'm in no danger of upsetting anybody.
No.
Have you noticed how everybody now all these people who have said up such awful things about Trump are now, they're not backpedaling, but they're playing it down. People have had to eat humble pie because of the reality of power. Now, I'm not involved in the reality of power anymore in the music business, so I can just say what I want. And, just generally, as with any working people over the last 30, 40 years, the conditions for working musicians have got worse and worse. And, these so-called stars, I mean, David Bowie offered Stevie Ray Vaughan $150 a gig. Can you believe that? $150 a gig.
Yes.
Give us a break. Anyway, carry on.
Yes.
Carry on,
but then you did you do one big performance though to
we did. Well, Second Vision. What happened with Second Vision was we got sidetracked. What happened with Second Vision was, yes, we had a really good launch. We had 5 nights at the Riverside Studios, and we had guests. We had Richard Thompson as a guest, Gordon Giltrap as a guest, June Tabor and Martin Simpson. I think that was it. And it was all organised by Joe, and it was brilliant. And it was a really good launch, and the album was well received, but somehow, probably down to me again, it all sort of petered out a bit. I think partly because I was still with Stefan Grappelli, so I had quite a good commitment that kept me going around the world. But I can't really remember what happened. But the album is a good album. I'm very proud of that album, and I think particularly good is the second track, "Dancing Circle," written by David Eastaugh. And it's an absolute killer. I mean, anybody who's listening to this, if you go to look on Spotify or whatever, "Dancing Circle" by Second Vision, it's really fantastic. It's a great bit of piano, and then, as I say, I play my only live solo at the end through a Marshall amp, which I really like as well. Yeah. And but there's some, it's a very well produced album. It's been reissued a few times, and we were talking about trying to get it reissued again, because it's got. I think probably of all the albums I've done, it's the one with the most care and attention put into it.
Yes,
because
how do you get on with studios and egos? Because a couple of months ago, I did an interview with an engineer who'd done Band Aid. Do they know it's Christmas? That was Stuart Bruce, and he mentioned that he then got a gig with John McLaughlin with 2 other guitarists called Guitars.
I know the story of this session because a friend of mine, Nigel Kennedy's ex-girlfriend...
he said the police were called solicitors. He was
That's right. I know the story. Perhaps I shouldn't...
Well, it sounded like it was almost like they were going to sue or get the police.
No. It came to fisticuffs.
Because they were like, the mix wasn't right.
That's very interesting, because I've heard the story from a load of people, and they all agree. Usually when you hear stories, you go to somebody, it wasn't like that. But I heard this from a old girlfriend of Nigel Kennedy's, who was working at real world. And she said how much they were looking forward to these three virtuosi coming in, and they thought they were going to get three guitarists trading off each other. And she said, well, first of all, they didn't ever play a note together. And then this fisticuff issue, which on a public service broadcast, I'm not going to say what I know about the names. Yeah. But anyway, there was some fisticuffs problem, police being called.
Yes.
But I do have to tell you, David, as a general rule, listeners, if anybody's listening, I used to think the higher up I get, in other words, the greater musicians I play with, the more saintly they're going to be. Well, I have to say, unfortunately, the higher they are in status, the more ego they've got. Generally, their prickly egos increase as stardom increases, and I don't know if they go together. In other words, you've got to have a prickly, ruthless ego to become a star. But certainly, being a star increases your ruthless, prickly ego until, in many cases, it becomes unbearable.
Yeah,
you become an unbearable person. And there are plenty of people, and I'm not going to mention any names, but anybody would know there are plenty of people who come into these categories and of sort of. I'm kind of. I haven't really moved in those circles, but you hear stories about all these people, even in jazz. People who are just awful. Great musicians, but awful people,
Yes, it's quite interesting. No, he I think he was quite traumatized, and I think,
Yes, yeah, well, she was traumatized. She was traumatized. She said she was in tears.
Yes, and I think people...
Yes, they were used to kind of, the normal kind of rock recording, all done in bits and little bit, and they were looking forward to some real music being played. I think it's fantastic. Anyway,
magic. Yeah. So you've never, thankfully, had to experience anything quite that appalling?
No, not really. But the point is recording. The point is, actually, serious point, is that recording music is gigs have a certain similar quality, but recording can be like anything. It can be quite relaxing. It can be extremely stressful. Because you're under the microscope, it's like being in an interrogation room with the secret police sitting in the control room with their microphones on, going, "Come on, then." And I mentioned before Steely Dan, and I think they had a way of, probably not deliberately, but a way of intimidating certainly the guest guitarists. And I'd say it probably wasn't deliberate. They'd just say, "Well, we were trying to get the best we could." But sometimes people don't understand that getting the best out of somebody doesn't mean just sort of staring at them going, "Will you do one more? No. Try another. No. Stop. No. Try another." That doesn't necessarily get the best out of people. I had a wonderful story, a little anecdote about this thing. Ginger Baker. Dick Exel-Smith, who I worked with for years, wonderful character. What a character, Dick Exel-Smith. They don't make them like that anymore. A really, really interesting man, and I loved him. Anyway, so he was rehearsing with Ginger and a young guitarist who was extremely nervous. And at one point, Ginger threw down, he kept looking at it wrong. Ginger threw down his sticks, goes over, picks the bloke up by the shirt, hangs him up against the wall and says, "Fucking relax, arsehole!" And put him down again and went back to the drum. And I said to Dick, "Did you get any better?" He said, "No, it got worse." Anyway, so the point is about recording. Depending, I can think of all the situations I've been in, millions of situations I've been in recording, some of which have been extremely high stress. I think recording a live album with John Williams was almost beyond stress, because in 2005 he said, "Let's record a duo album." I went, "Oh, what? Oh, okay, right. We'll do it live. Let's do it live at the Dublin Guitar Festival, right?" So I went, "Oh my God, okay." yes, we'll record it live at the Dublin Guitar Festival. And I said, well, at least let's put in some warm-up gigs. So we did a couple of warm-up gigs. But basically, when we got to this, it was Dublin Guitar Festival, 1,000 people in the room, including Paco Peña, Manuel Barreto, a whole lot of other all guitarists, mainly classical guitarists, has to be said, at least. And the night before, Paco Peña said to me, "You're very brave." I said, "I'm not brave. He's making me do it." And Manuel Barreto said to John Williams, "I would never record live like that." And he said, "Well," John said, "I wouldn't for a classical thing, but for this, So we recorded live. We had done a couple of warm-up gigs, but not much. And there was no separation on the instruments. And what, if you understand the recording process, separation means that if somebody makes a mistake, their track is discrete and you can redo it. We didn't have any of that. So it was all or nothing. And I was just beside myself, really, absolutely. And I did all right. And then there was one thing where my brain just switched off. And it was a Bach duo piece we were doing. And my brain just collapsed. So what we did, actually, we managed to retrieve that by going back into the hall the next day with the microphone set up exactly the same and playing the whole thing through. And that, it is still basically live. But when we were mixing this album, I said to the engineer, I described to the mixing engineer how we did the album. He said, "Blimey," he said, "I mixed the Eagles live." He said, "The only thing that ended up live was the bass drum. Everything else was redone." And so we couldn't redo it. So it's a real live album. So if you listen to places between, it's got John Williams, John Etheridge live in Dublin. It's very exciting for that reason. Well, you see, this is the interesting thing about this kind of recording. It's extremely stressful, but you do get a vibration of something really happening live. I was listening yesterday to one of my favourite hard bop tracks, which is Art Blakey at Birdland in 1956, playing with Clifford Brown, Lou Donaldson, and it's kind of just before the Jazz Messengers. It's called the Art Blakey All Stars, and they're being recorded now. That's a very big deal in the 1950s if you've got a live recording going on, and it's kind of rough, but it's. If anybody thinks bebop jazz is boring, I could play them this track because it's just crackling with nervous tension and energy. And the audience are getting really ripped because they've been told by the MC that they're being recorded. So they're going, they're egging the soloists on, and it's so exciting. And this record of ours is actually, if you listen to the first track, which is Extra Time, which is the Bach piece, it's really exciting. It's sort of, and you wouldn't think, me and John Williams would be that exciting, but it is. I'm not discussing the quality of the music. I'm just saying the kind of vibration in the air.
Yes.
You're only going to get that vibration in the air with live recording or live in the studio recording, which the Soft Machine we tend to do live in the studio. Now, live in the studio is fine if you know the people involved, but live in the studio with people you don't know is pretty frightening, really, because the opportunity for discomfort is enormous. The thing is, if you're playing a gig, 2 nights ago I was playing a gig in Bath with people I don't know. Now, you play with people you don't know. Okay, one number goes a bit wrong. You can do the next number, that doesn't quite work. You just carry on. It carries on in real time.
Yes.
But in the recording, you go, hang on, that's not happening. And then you hear these absolutely, I've had 1 or 2 horrors myself, but you hear these sort of horror stories about, there's one story, John Heisman, that told me about a very well-known superstar drummer. Somebody thought they'd get him in for a session. And they said, give us a 4-bar intro. And he couldn't play the 4 bars properly in time. And they did it a few times. And then to save embarrassment, they had to pretend that the studio had broken down. They said, we've broken down the studio. The studio's broken down. We'll have to adjourn till we'll call you when we've got it up and running. That was the only way they could get out of the situation. Now, of course, if you're playing live, you just carry on and you play. And in the bar, you might moan about something and say, oh, God, that was pretty rough, But it's gone. But when it's recording, it's not gone. And also, there are so many multiple ways of recording. Through my life, I've recorded in all sorts of ways. And I have to say, some of the ways that people don't approve of, people of my generation don't approve of, I quite enjoy now, like recording onto a computer from a track. I've done quite a lot of tracks for Cleopatra Records in America, and you end up playing with people like Billy Cobham and Dennis Chambers and people like this, simply because they've sent you a track and you put your guitar on. And the point is, you can do that bit by bit. You can do it at your own speed. It's a bit like being a painter. You can go, oh, let's put a bit of blue there. Let's put a bit of... So you don't have to do it in real time, and that's considerably less stressful. And, recording in real time, I mean, in my day, when there were lots of sessions, what I mean by sessions is catering sessions, which I never really did. When somebody says, we want a guitarist, play a rock and roll solo here. And there were guys like Martin Kershaw who would do 4 or 5 sessions a day, and they ended up having nervous breakdowns because it's a permanent high stress, because somebody's going to say, I want you to do that. And you go, well, actually, I don't feel like doing that. I want to do this. No, mate, you're doing that. And the highest, it's recognised that the highest stress is responsibility with no control. Okay? In other words, you say, in bar 75, you're going to play an arpeggio from the bottom E to the top E, including the flat and fifth. So you're waiting for bar 75. If I fuck this up, So that kind of recording is just horrible. And not doing that kind of recording much anymore is great. So the Darrell Ways Wolf recordings were tricky at first because I'd never been in a studio, and that always gets people down. Just wearing cans. Mm. Just recording with cans on messes you up, because you're hearing the things in the way that you never did when you're playing live. The stories about Oasis trying to do their first album, I mean, they were a great live act in their own way, and they just couldn't get it happening. And I remember Nigel Kennedy album I made with him, and we toured America. We'd been 6 weeks on the road, and then he wanted to go and record an album. So we went in and we started trying to do it, he started trying to do it like normal modern recording. And we ended up, luckily, it was Bryan Adams' studio, and the room was big enough. We ended up recreating the gig in the studio with monitors and everything, and we played the gig as if we were playing live. And in fact, I think there's one track, Little Wing, or one of them, where I actually break a string halfway through, but I just carried on with 5 strings because it was a completely live technique. Right. But no separation, no spill. So when they mixed it, they had to... And, of course, that was fine in a way because we'd done 6 weeks on the road. And the other thing about modern recording is usually you don't know your material. If you listen to the Beatles' first album or the Stones' first album, they're playing stuff that they've played for 5 years, night after night. So when they go in, obviously it's a little bit strange, but it's pretty well, they put it down, boom. But, you often are sort of recording stuff you've half rehearsed and you're not quite sure. So if you know the people well, like the Soft Machine, we do it live.
Yes.
We record live in the studio, drums, bass, guitar, saxophone, all going on at the same time. And then we do have separation so that if you make a mistake, it doesn't ruin a whole track. I mean, it's hilarious. My son got very keen on jazz, and when he was about 12 or 13, so I started listening with his acute young ears, and we got out all the versions of Charlie Parker, Billy's Bounce, which was the first Charlie Parker recording session. And it's him and Miles Davis, actually, not Dizzy Gillespie. And the tune is called Billy's Bounce. Okay, so it's quite tricky. Then they've got to do solos and they've got to do the tune at the end. Well, It's so typical. They did about 7 takes. Nobody ever played the tune correctly, particularly at the end. And the take they took as the master take had the worst Charlie Parker solo. It wasn't bad because it's Charlie Parker, but it was the least good Charlie Parker solo. But the tune was played almost acceptably by you've got the alto and the trumpet playing in unison, and it's just about okay. So they took that one because in those days you couldn't redo, but now of course with separation we can redo. So you go for it, and of course then there's Pro Tools, you see, and I'm afraid like most people in the last 20 years, I've often taken advantage of Pro Tools. You play the tune in unison with somebody, and you're a little bit out, and then you get on the computer and you can just move that note, So really, the capability now. I mean, I'm obviously, people know this, but it's worth saying things that perhaps people don't realise that just like photography, that now anything you hear on record, you can't rely that was actually a performance, And in fact, a couple of years ago, I went to the Ullapool Guitar Festival. I've been there a few times and done some solo gigs there. And the guy said, "What about?" He mentioned the name of somebody. "What about this guy?" I said, "Well, you've got his record, haven't you?" He said, "Oh, of course the record sounds fine." He said, "But we've had people up here whose records sound amazing and they can hardly play." Because they put it together bit by bit,
Yeah, but isn't that, it's because I did an interview with a guy who was a musician, but also his day job, well, what paid the rent was his kind of production and engineering and doing live work and being a guitar tech as one does. But he was telling me that even live shows now, that there's computers that if the person can't quite pull off that guitar solo live, the computer will kind of kick in and they'll just have it.
Gosh. Oh, I'm sure. Certainly Auto-Tune has been working on voices for forever.
Yes.
No, I'm sure. There's just that all.
So it looks like they're playing live, but actually, it's
exactly. Well, probably I don't know that about instrumentalists. I'm sure it's possible. Everything's possible now, but of course, it all takes money. So when you're at my level, you can be damn sure that what you're seeing is actually happening. There's no opportunity for trickery. But if you're in a big stadium, I'm sure.
Yes.
God, these big artists like Taylor Swift and Madonna and things, who knows what goes on? Certainly I would have thought, I'm not going to mention names again, any names, but I'm sure that certain huge artists, particularly when they do a lot of dancing. And if you do a lot of dancing around, it's then very, very hard to sing. It's very hard to combine those. So you probably find that their voices are not dubbed, but auto-tuned while they're singing. The auto-tuner will work live, so that if you're near the note, it'll push you up to the note. You've got to be somewhere near. But if you're slightly flat or sharp, it'll just put it right.
Nice. So just going back, your 80s then, you did a lot of touring, didn't you? And then you did another solo album or duo.
Well, I don't know. I describe the 80s as the sort of dark decade for me. For everybody of my age. People were a lot. I was lucky in the sense that because I played with Stephen Grappelli, I was accepted in the jazz world.
Right.
And jazz, broadly speaking, because of the sort of there was a kind of revival in a sense of some sort. I came with Wynton Marsalis and then Courtney Pine here, etc. So that world wasn't too bad, but the prog hippie world was finished. I could give you a very good example. The great Hugh Hopper, who was a soft machine bass player, who played with us again in the 2000s. He had I didn't know this, but he had a solo album out in 1985, right? Anyway, it was re-released about 2007 and got a glowing review. And I phoned him up. I said, "Oh, well done, Hugh. Well done. Good review for your album." He said, "Yeah, you should have seen the review in 1985. This superannuated hippie bore and his irrelevant, dribbly noodles. We don't need this stuff." Then that was how the 80s was about us. you know.
Yes.
And,
But I noticed, though, quite a few artists who had that moment in the 70s, their 80s work generally wasn't that amazing, you know, like, I mean, you know, basically all of them. And a part of it was like in the 70s, they
basically
might
all
have.
of them. Well, they lost. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, because in a way they were sort of doing their thing in the 70s and leading the way. And then in the 80s, it almost looked like they sat back a bit and then wondered what was hip. So they would get that producer, that sound, and go to that studio. And so instead of leading it, they seemed to be following it. But then.
Well, they were obviously following it because they were older. I mean, I now admire, although I couldn't stand their music, all those people like OMD, because they said, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We're going to do our own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I hated their own thing, obviously, but I now respect that they were actually, the 80s was the last time where you didn't get anything backward looking, not in pop music. And they rock music, and they not rock because they didn't want to be rock, pop music.
Yes.
They really wanted to do something that didn't have any reference to us. So good for them. So the people, I mean, you mentioned David Bowie. As I understand it, he had a very bad patch as well.
Mm.
You know, and people like Jeff Beck just stopped playing. I mean, I saw Jeff Beck in 1981, and then I didn't really hear anything much about him until about 88, 89.
Yes.
He recorded Star Shop. There was no, particularly in England, there was no interest. I think bands that were touring America could carry on because America had A, a huge market, B, there's enough people who are less fashion conscious. But you know, British music has always been, and in a way, this is not necessarily a pejorative valuation. They is sort of fashion conscious, and so I say we, but the classic hippies, say like Hugh Hopper, who couldn't go and play jazz and who wasn't. I mean, I was incredibly busy on what you'd call the jazz scene. I mean, I wasn't sort of cutting my cloth really that much. I was playing pretty well the same way, but it fitted on the sort of what you might call the kind of contemporary end of the jazz scene, which is where I worked all the way through the 80s. But nothing really coming together.
No, but those albums, there was a Jethro Tull album, and that was like odd because I think Ian Anderson had sacked the band, then he'd employed them, and then, you know, Rod Stewart's solo albums, Robert Plant's solo albums, Bowie's solo albums, they all started going. Oh, and like you mentioned, Jeff Beck, there was nothing there which was very interesting. It was all.
I think you see, these people you mentioned, I'm not. So a lot of them I don't know a lot about. I know there were various yeses going around. Trevor Rabin and things. Yeah, and various yeses. And it was all, yes, you're right. And in a way, what happened in about mid-90s, the first band that I heard reforming was Colosseum, about 94. John Heisman reformed Colosseum with Dick Hetzel-Smith and Glenn Clemson. And that was, reforming old prog, well, they weren't that old, but they were about 50 prog bands, and then Caravan did it, and there was a kind of revival in interest in the 90s in those people and that area. Yeah. And you will know more about it than I, because I really, really know about my area, but it's certainly, and Soft Machine were very late in the picture because of the various sort of factions and various not very good vibrations, and not having a leader to put it together. The point is, John Heisman led Colosseum and he reformed it. Pi Hastings led Caravan, he reformed it. Soft Machine was always a sort of democracy.
Yeah. So there was and also the younger generation, like the Zombies, suddenly people kept talking about that last studio album they did, which
yes.
And it was almost like they'd given up and had just gone off, and it was like, please reform and play that album again, because we all.
Yeah, well, I think I've got a lot of friends who are around mid-50s, so they were kind of late teens, early 20s in the 80s, and a lot of them said, I hated up the music of my era. I didn't like it. I listened to Led Zeppelin or something, and then later on, people went this 60s, 70s music, and for instance, the guy who put us together to reform the Soft Machine, a guy called Leonardo Pavkovich. He was at that time around, so he's a bit, 15 years younger than me, sort of thing. So he was around 40 odd at the time. And he said, you know, the music of you guys. Sorry, I'm doing because he's a Bosnian. In order to do something, I've got to do a bit of the accent. So sorry, Leonardo. Oh, you look, you know, the thing about you guys from the 60s, early 70s, when you play, it's a different thing. It has like an authenticity, you know. And I'm going, okay, right, okay, if you say so. So he really wanted to reform. He was really keen on the music of that era. And so we reformed the Soft Machine in about 2004 with Hugh Hopper, Alan Dean, myself and John Marshall. And it's still going. I mean,
Yes.
it was always, you know, it wasn't a full-time commitment for any of us, but it was always been one of my major commitments because I loved being in the Soft Machine in the 70s. And I was so proud to be in the Soft Machine in the 70s. That was the thing. And so I was very glad to revisit it, you know, and it was, you know, I was very, very pleased to do it. And we're still going on. I mean, I'm the only one left who's got any connection with the old Soft Machine.
Yes.
But I thought, well, when John Marshall and Roy Babington go, we'll have to pack up. But actually, the point is we've got Fred Baker and Asaph Circus in. It's so good. And everybody who comes along knows what they're getting. You know, there's no sort of pulling the wool over people's eyes. They know what it is. That it's a sort of continuation, like Manchester United. You know, you carry on. You don't have, you know, Matt Busby or something, but you carry. And
yes.
And so, you know, nobody comes up going, "Where's Mike Rutledge? Where's Kevin Ayres? Where's Robert Wyatt?" So, you know, and people accept that. So and the point is, it's so good. It's by far the best band I've ever been in.
Yeah,
so
but we listen to classical music, and we're not upset and think that shouldn't be done because Mozart's dead or Bach's dead.
Exactly.
You know, it's like you can't sort of be that pure because we wouldn't be listening to anything.
No, exactly. And I understand if people say, "Well, I'm not interested because it hasn't got." Fair enough. But I mean, there's, you know, but I mean, the thing that keeps me going with it is it's just I love it, and it's the only band I'm in which is a democracy, which is really nice. So I don't feel it's totally about me, but then I don't feel like I'm a sort of sideman. It's a proper band. It's the only proper band I've ever been in.
Yes. Well, just going back to your 90s, I know people go, no, talk about Soft Machine, but you worked with Nigel for quite a few years, and he was the hot potato, and also then you did another album with Andy Summers.
Yes, I did. I worked with Nigel Kennedy. That is for a long time, and that was an intermittent thing, and very exciting character, an amazing musician. You know, obviously, like fantastic. You know, very stimulating guy. I mean, we were always playing. That's what I remember about being in Nigel Kennedy's environment. We're always playing music the whole time. So I'd get up wherever we were, have breakfast, then I'd say to the bass player, "Come on, let's go and play." We'd play, and then we'd go off to the sound check. Then Nigel would appear. We'd play for hours at the sound check. We'd do the gig. Then we could go from the gig to a restaurant or something, and then we'd start playing, and we'd play till 2 or 3 in the morning, go to bed, and then we'd probably, me and the bass player would be jamming in the morning again. Nigel wouldn't be part of that because he was doing his individual classical practice for 3 hours. So he was playing the violin the whole time. And that's so stimulating. It gets you going. So I was playing guitar the whole time.
Yes.
And that's what we were doing, you know, smoking dope, playing guitar and doing the gigs. And the gigs were just a part of the playing. And so he's a very inspiring guy, you know, in that sense.
Brilliant.
Because he's absolutely dead. You know, people used to think, "Oh, he doesn't." He gave this impression it was all kind of lightweight, but he's not a lightweight at all. He's really serious.
Yes,
he's really serious about his music.
I think it was his voice or accent.
Yes, exactly, and the way he's got this way of sort of like being casual bonhomie, which is great. He's a very sociable bloke, but he's an absolutely dedicated musician. I mean, he couldn't be like what he is if he wasn't absolutely dedicated.
No, absolutely.
he's like a lot of people. I think he sort of give the superficial impression that he wasn't really bothered and that he was not really practicing, but he was a really fierce practicer and always wanted to rehearse and was always having run-ins with particularly English orchestras that wouldn't rehearse enough, and really hard working, really hard working man.
And what was the experience with Andy like? Because you did this album.
Well, Andy and I were friends. Well, basically, Andy and I were friends for years, from about 1976 onwards. Just before the Police started, we became pals. He was playing with Kevin Ayers, and I was playing with Soft Machine. And we started jamming together, and he's a big jazz man. And so he'd come around my place and we'd be, playing jazz tunes. And he sort of said, one day he turned up, with blonde hair. I said, what's going on? He said, oh, well, I met this guy and we're doing this. And I go, yeah, great, because he was quite an age then. He'd been around. He
was, yes.
Well, I'd known of him when I was at school, when Zoot Money. Zoot Money's rolling big rock band with Andy Summers. And so he was a face, and so and a very good player, so we played together and all this stuff would start up. And, I heard the odd thing. And then one day we're playing and the babysitter came in and screamed and collapsed on the floor when she saw it. I thought, what's going on here, mate? He said, yeah, well, I told you, we're doing pretty well, this band, The Police. I went, really? You're my jazz mate. You can't tell me you're going to be in a successful rock band. And, of course, it went, and then I started going, well, bloody hell, Andy's actually really successful. And then we started hanging out. We'd go to the parties, go to the gigs. And so we managed to stay friends because, first of all, I didn't know enough to be intimidated. I mean, I was so far away from the pop rock world by then. And also we'd been pals a bit before, but not too far before, so that, his old pals, I think, were really freaked out, Their mate, their transit mate is suddenly a world superstar. So that was difficult for them. And then anybody he met after he became a superstar, I think you were suspicious, aren't you? You think, well, you just want to know me because I'm... So we kept up a friendship. And then finally, we were always playing. I think it was up me. I said, well, why don't we do something? It's around 1988, long after the Police had finished. So we started recording an album, which we sort of did dribs and drabs of over a few years. And finally came out, I think, 93. And it's been reissued a few times. And we did a sort of world tour for a year. 2 acoustic guitars. It's impossible to describe, really. It was textural, really, rather than lots of soloing. It was a kind of textural duet. But I think we were pretty good, actually. I had no benchmark to put against, because it wasn't Al Di Meola and John McLaughlin or something. We weren't flying about and doing all that. And it was... we played some kind of jazz tunes. We did some arrangements of Police tunes for 2 acoustic guitars. And it was good. And the tour, we went all over. We went to South America, Japan, USA, Europe, England. It was a sort of year's world tour.
God,
basically.
That's fantastic. That must have been quite nice.
Then we sort of, we've done odd things. But I always see him. As a pal, and we always have a little play. I saw him last June. Got the guitars out over in Santa Monica. I was there with Soft Machine, and I went and visited him. We got the guitars out, played a few tunes. We also play Manoir de Carnaval by Louis Bonfal. That was one of our tunes that we always play. And he's a really, really fine all-round musician. He's a great man for picking just the right chord for just the right moment, which I think was what he did in the Police so brilliantly.
Yes, absolutely.
And his whole chord style was very much his, and that was really a major part of the Police sound. That if anybody's into music, the raised ninths on the, if you think someone like to do ron, just A to E, but he puts a raised ninth in on the A chord and then on the E chord. So it just adds a sort of characteristic, colourful sound to make it not just straightforward rock tune. And that's coming from his jazz influence. You know, he's a really very, very keen listener.
Yeah.
And so we're still big pals. You know, I see him, you know, whenever I can. He comes over quite a lot. And I saw the Police reunion tour, which was brilliant.
I would imagine.
I was so moved because he told me, I went all the way through with him. You know, he was over quite a lot. We'd have dinner and I'd say how it's going, and he'd tell me all the ins and outs. And I said, first off, when he said they were doing it, I said, well, presumably you're going to have backup keyboards and this, that. He said, no, just three of us. I thought, wow, that's, you know, really bold. And when I saw the first gig at Birmingham NEC, I went up with him in the car and saw it. I was very moved because it was so good. And of course, actually, it was much better than they were in 1983 because he and Sting particularly, Sting obviously so much more experience, and he had been playing away all sorts of situations ever since. Stuart, I'm not sure what he was doing, but he sounded fine, fantastic. And of course, the sound was so much better than it was in the 80s. I mean, the sound was immaculate. And it was just a really, really good. And I was really moved because I thought, wow, man, that's, you know, hats off. And, you know, they weren't old, but Andy was oldish. I mean, I guess Sting was like late 50s. But they just played. It was great. You know, it was really, really good thing. And I thought it was going to, you know, I didn't think it was going to be lame, but I couldn't imagine it being so damn good and so much better than they were in the 80s. Live. I mean, recordings, but the live act in the 80s was great. But it was just 2008, 2009. It was spot on.
Yes, and then just before the hour, you also did a recording with Hawkwind, didn't you, in 2014?
No, I played with Hawkwind. I didn't record. I'll tell you what, I got asked to do an animal charity. This is quite an amusing story, really. Asked to do an animal charity show at Shepherd's Bush Empire. Come and play some solo tunes. I went, fine, okay. And they said, it's Shepherd's Bush Empire. Headline is the Hawkwind. Hawkwind are going to get them. They're very big animal rights people. They're the headline band. So great. And then a few days before, Dave Brock phoned me up and said, we've been listening to you. Your stuff. Do you want to come and play some tunes with us? So I went, yeah, sure. I'll do my solo set. I'll come and play some tunes with you. Great. You know, I can't remember if I asked him which tunes or I'll just join in. Anyway, I can't remember that. But what I do remember, I turned up and said, it's John Etheridge, I'm here to play a solo set. And the MC looked at the list and said, well, you're not on this list. I went, but I've been invited to play. And she went, well, okay, you can play one tune. No, I didn't care. And then, of course, I was there, and I played one tune solo, and then I played with Hawkwind. And there's a bit on YouTube where we do High Rise Block, and it's pretty good, actually. I like it. Do a nice sort of bit of solo guitar in it, and it's I like High Rise Block. It's a great tune. And then he said, well, why don't you come on tour? And that was 2014. So I did, I'm just trying to remember if I did one tour or two tours. I think I just did that one tour with them. I had to miss a few gigs because I had some Nigel Kennedy gigs, I think, actually, which are already in a book. But I did quite a long tour with them. Very enjoyable, good blokes, you know, really. And I like Dave Rock a lot. And, you know, people go, whoa, Hawkwind. But actually, it's a very improvisational band. It's kind of Grateful Dead-ish. It's pre-genre. That's what you see. You've got to remember somebody like me, really, because there are so many things I don't really hear. I knew of Hawkwind, but when I played with them at the Empire, I enjoyed it. And then going on tour, I realised that it's kind of pre-80s in the sense that it's really late 60s, early 70s in the sense that there's plenty of room for things to happen. You know, there are set things, but there's quite a lot of improvisational passages, and that totally suited me because if I've got one kind of, I'd say, one characteristic is that I prefer improvisation to organisation, and it really depends what makes you more nervous. I mean, I've played with so many classical type players who are completely feel confident once there's music there. That's fine. As soon as it's perhaps an improvisational passage, they get all twitchy. Well, most of us are the opposite. As soon as there's a bit of music written down, I start tensing up, And as soon as it's like improvisation time, I'm going, great. I feel really at ease here. So I felt really at ease in Hawkwind, because the songs are not that unsophisticated, but they're quite relatively easy to follow. So I just follow along, and then Brock would look at me, and I'd do a bit of solo and or not, or and then somebody else would take over. Then he perhaps direct somebody else, or all worked pretty well. I mean, he was kind of leading it, of course, because he's Dave Brock, and like a lot of these bands, he's the only bloke. Your Lemmy you were talking about, he'd gone a long time ago. So Brock is the only guy. That's the thing. Most of these bands have one guy who was, and of course Dave Brock was the founder, Hastings, founder of Caravan. So that's that was that. I mean, I played with them again. Yes, and we did the Hawk Fest with Soft Machine a couple of times.
Right.
And I wanted to play. That's right. I was going to play with them, and for some reason I couldn't because I had to get back. It was the next day at the Hawk Fest or something. But we're still in touch. In fact, you're right. Give Dave Brock a call, because he's a remarkable man. He's about 84, I think.
Yes, and they've got a new album and a small tour coming up. So
exactly. Oh, I know when I last played with them in Bilbao in Spain about 2 years ago.
Blimey.
And what happened? It was going to do the whole tour, and then the tour fell through, and it was because their guitarist at the time had gone off to do something else. They said, "Would you come and sort of fill in?" I went, "Sure," and it ended up with, like a lot of these tours, ends up with one gig in Bilbao, and I went out to Bilbao and we played the gig. It was great, very enjoyable, and but they've got a regular. See, when I did it before, they didn't have a frontline guitarist, but now they've got one, a guy called Marcus, and I think he's obviously the guy. But I'm always up for it for them. I mean, I also have done quite a lot with Caravan over the years.
Yes,
and that is another one where I'm sort of debt for substitute for Jeff Richardson when he's away, and I love doing that. I mean, that's a song-based band, but then it's pretty organised, but it's just very enjoyable. It's if you're around people of your own generation, it's great. You kind of have the same sensibility. And so I enjoy doing those. But my major thing is the Soft Machine. But I've got my own trios and quite a lot of bands I run.
So what have you got lined up for 2025 then?
We've got to tell you exactly what I've got lined up. I actually know. Normally, I'd be going, I'll probably be doing a few gigs for it. I pretty well know what I've got lined up. Okay, we've got quite a lot of Soft Machine. We've got a few gigs in March, sort of UK tour in March. Then May, we've got Europe. Then August, I've got a Scottish tour with violinist Chris Garrick doing duos. And then in October, I've got a whole month with Gordon Giltrap, which is brilliantly put together, and that's great fun because Gordon is exactly the same age as me.
Oh yes,
and he plays solo, I play solo, then we play something together. It's a nice evening, and we've got about. In fact, the whole of October we've got. The guy said I could have filled every day, and I said no. We're a bit old. Give us a few days off. Then November is more Soft Machine. But no, America's finished, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Yes.
I've heard the USA is now out of the question. But we did do 3 tours there last year of varying, all musically very successful. Little bit of difficulties. It's tough. But I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I think I've done my last gig in the USA.
Yes. Is that because of visas or because you just...
well, all sorts of things, really. Visas are incredibly hard, yeah. Yeah, visas are ridiculous. The whole thing is ridiculous.
Yes.
It's really, really hard. The audiences were marvellous. People are lovely. But I tell you what, this governmental situation there is just... it's just... it's just not pleasant.
No, it's...
it's not pleasant at all. You're just trying to get visas to work and things. You feel like you're some sort of criminal. It's really... and I would personally, although it would mean we wouldn't see good people, I would advocate some reciprocity here. American musicians can just come here. They don't realise, bless them, it's not their fault. They could just come here just like that and play. And, I think they pay 40 quid or something. I think our visas are about $1,500 each person in the band, and if you're working at a level like we were working at the Soft Machine, all the tours lost money, So apart from the fact you toured the USA and you can boast it, put it up on Facebook big time, which is great. And the audience, I have to say, if anybody American listening, the audience is marvellous and the people are lovely. And they're actually really pleased to see you. I think they're pleased to see you because it's so difficult for a medium-level band to tour America. So, obviously, they see the huge acts, but a sort of medium-level band like us in a club level, it's so hard to do that they don't see that many. So they're really appreciative.
Yes.
You can't make it pay. And also, it's it's a difficult place. It's hard. Yes. So, that probably won't happen, but we got Europe. I'll continue with Europe, hopefully. Anyway, this year, so we got a nice European tour with Soft Machine, and then I've got gigs with my. I've got a really nice trio. We've got an album out. It's relatively current. It's been out like 8-10 months now. The band's called Blue Spirits. It's a trio, and organ, drums, and guitar. And that's a nice. I'm very pleased with that. And then we've got. Recording a new Soft Machine album in April, which we've been rehearsing for.
Right.
Busily writing music for, and we've had some rehearsals. It's looking good. And so that'll be out the end of January, the end of this year, I guess. And then probably in a couple of years, a year and a half later, we'll put out a live one we got loads of live recordings from last year. From the tour last year, we've got just if they were tapes, we'd have tapes up to there, so we can sort through them and choose some really good stuff. So that's all good.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to John for giving me the time for that. I will put a link in the notes below of his website. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. On all the other usual social media platform sites. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.